Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View, where you have lots to talk about this day. And so we're going to spend some time looking at a number of items in the news. Thought I might start off for something maybe a little bit more lighthearted, although it may be more intense. You never know, because we have the NFL draft today, and because we're broadcasting here in Dallas, I suspect many of you may are paying more attention to it than ever before. Got one of my friends that actually is going to be able to attend that. You have to have kind of special invitations, but he knows a Dallas Cowboy, so he'll be sitting there while they're making those announcements. And for those of you in the Dallas area listening to this, mostly it's Dallas listeners, although we do have some listening online. Dallas Cowboys actually pick, I think, 19th. And the kind of the conventional wisdom is that the first 16 are probably first round ready to play kind of players, you know, like Johnny Manziel or Ryan Leach. Well, that didn't turn out so well, did it? And then later on, you end up with the people that aren't going to do so well, and they go like in the third round or the sixth round, you know, like Joe Montana or Tom Brady. And then, of course, some of them don't get drafted at all. And, of course, you never expect them to do well in the NFL. It'd be like, oh, I don't know, Tony Romo, Bill Bates. You can see I'm having a little bit of fun with this. Even though we think these individuals are very good at judging talent, sometimes we've had some incredible busts in the NFL draft. And, of course, we've had some incredible opportunities for people who either were drafted sometimes in the late rounds or not drafted at all, come in and do extremely well in the NFL. So we'll see how that plays out. But before we get into some of the news items, the NFL leaders, that would be primarily the owners and some NFL staff, got together and had a summit about kneeling. And I think if they had televised this, there might have been as many people watching it as the NFL draft, because it was an attempt to try to answer this question: are we going to continue to lose ratings and audience interest if indeed we still have individuals that are taking a knee during the Star-Spangled Banner and the national anthem? And so one of the things that was said by Roger Goodell is, he starts the meeting by saying, let's make sure that we keep this confidential. Fat chance of that, right? You know, let's face it, if you're in a meeting, even if it's a confidential meeting, if people have their cell phone, they can just keep it on. And interestingly enough, what you have are people recording all of those particular elements. And, of course, even if they didn't record them on their smartphone or a tape recorder, they can remember them. And so this is why you've got a couple of individuals that have posted some articles about this. And these are what are called 6 takeaways from the NFL's Kneeling Summit. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time on that. And then we're going to get into the possibility that the migrant caravan that's in Mexico will cross into the United States. And so that gets us into the whole issue of immigration. We have a judge that is actually telling Donald Trump that he has 90 days to restart the DACA program. You know, that one that was started illegally in the first place. Of course, we have the French president here today, yesterday, I should say, and Emmanuel Macron. We'll get into that, and just a number of other topics. But let's talk real quickly about the 6 points. And the first point was they talked about Colin Kaepernick. You think? Of course they did. Players told the owners they felt that Kaepernick was being blackballed for his politics, and that's what some of the players were saying. And again, one of the defensive linemen for Eagles said if he was on the roster right now, all the negativity and divisiveness could be turned into a positive. We all agree in this room as players that he should be on a roster. So that was the first thing. Number two, Eric Reid called out the owners directly. Former 49ers teammate Eric Reid, dressed in a Kaepernick T-shirt, challenged the owners in the room and said, I feel like he was hung out to dry. Everyone here is talking about how much they support us. Nobody stepped up and said, we support Colin's right to do this. Instead, he's become public enemy number one. And so, again, that was one thing that came from that meeting. Number three, the NFL needs a black spokesman. That comes, interesting enough, from Bills owner Terry Pagula. He says the NFL needs a spokesperson, preferably a player, and even more preferably a black player, to combat its media problem. And he goes on to say, for years we watched the National Rifle Association use Charlton Heston as a figurehead. For us to have a face as an African-American, at least a face could be in the media, we would fall in behind that. Not for nothing, though, this could have been Colin Kaepernick, but of course it was not. And so, you can see what they want and what they get. Number four, kneeling, they said, is the elephant in the room. This was very important for the owners to talk about because it was impacting their money. Although the players had to bring it up, TV ratings were slipping and sponsors were concerned about public perception of the protest. Patriots owner and Mill Meek advocated Bob Kraft, referring to the anthem demonstrations as the elephant in the room. And again, going back to the Buffalo Bills owner, he said, we're getting hit with a tsunami. So there was one metaphor from the oceans. I've run into a few more here as well. Texas owner Bob McNair, who famously uttered the inmates' comment at the same meeting, was vocal about his desire to put an end to the anthem protest. And it says, you fellas need to ask your compadres, stop this other business. Number five, some NFL owners are annoyed with Trump. Of course, you remember all of that as well. And then finally, they also said that some of them actually still fear him. So the concern is that these owners, which will all be very visible today in the draft, also recognize that the future of the NFL, I mean, it's not going away, let's face it, but its economic decline is due, at least in part, to whether or not some of these newer players that come on to this forum from the college ranks, and then the existing players, whether they take a knee and whether that turns off more of the viewers, and that certainly affects everything from ad revenues to their own pocketbook. So we'll see where that goes. And again, just thought I'd mention it today as we are having the NFL draft just down the road from where we're broadcasting here in the Dallas area. Before we take a break, let me just mention that something we've been watching for some time has been the caravan that came from Latin American countries through Mexico. And many people thought that it would dissipate. Well, it sort of did and sort of did not, because groups decided to gather together. So now hundreds of Central American migrants from a caravan that's crossed Mexico have now all reunited in Tijuana, and they plan to cross the border this weekend in defiance of some of the threats by the president, Donald Trump, to repel them. The timing of the migrants' arrival could compromise a flurry of talks this week to renegotiate NAFTA, which is called the North American Free Trade Agreement, which Trump has repeatedly threatened to scrap if Mexico does not crack down on the flow of Central Americans across and through its territory. So you have busloads of migrants that began actually arriving about 2 days ago at a shelter, which is really just a 5-minute walk from the border, and actually within sight of a U.S. flag waving under an overpass connecting the two countries. And while many rested in tents after this month-long journey across Mexico, others wandered up to the border to contemplate their next stage. And I thought it was interesting. One of those individuals said, the wall doesn't look that tall. I really want to cross it. So I think this weekend we are going to hear a lot more about immigration, because we have hundreds that are talking about crossing the border down at Tijuana and San Diego. See how that plays out. Got more to cover? We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The congressional hearings with Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg mostly focused on data collection and privacy. Fortunately, Senator Ted Cruz also raised important questions about what he called a pervasive pattern of bias and political censorship. And Senator Ben Sasse said he thought America might be better off not being policed by one company that has a really big and powerful platform. He even asked the founder if he could define hate speech. It turns out that censorship by Facebook is more than just incidental, and the problem of censorship is more pervasive. All of the big tech companies engage in censorship. Here are just a few examples. Facebook shut down the Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day page and has blocked a post by Fox News reporter Todd Starnes. Apparently, over 24 Catholic pages have been blocked. And, of course, the most recent example was the decision by Facebook about the African-American ladies known as Diamond and Silk, who Facebook considered unsafe for the community. Lots of people have had Twitter pull down their comments. For example, Representative Marsha Blackburn was blocked on Twitter because of her statement that I fought Planned Parenthood and we stopped the sale of baby body parts. Twitter shut down her video ad campaign, claiming it was inflammatory and negative. Speaking on videos, there's a lot of censorship at YouTube. Videos by pro-life groups have been removed. Dennis Prager and Prager University filed to stop YouTube from censoring their videos. A California federal judge dismissed their complaint. And in previous commentaries, I've talked about how Apple removed Chuck Colson's Manhattan Declaration from its iTunes App Store, and there are other religious apps that have also been removed. Each of these big tech giants portrays themselves as a neutral public forum. There is growing evidence of their bias and censorship. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Everyone's going to, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Also, of course, we broadcast on a number of different venues at pointofview.net, but also you can go to Facebook Live and see the broadcast and leave a comment there. I'd be glad to read it as well. Let me just mention that Mike Pompeo has been confirmed by the United States Senate 54-41. Last time as CIA director, he was confirmed by 66 votes, so it shows you that at least 12 individuals that thought he was qualified to be a CIA director said, nah, maybe not qualified to be Secretary of State, and that is, of course, not what they really believe in their heart of hearts. They know he's qualified. They just simply recognize that if they are Democrats, they can't vote for Mike Pompeo because they'll be primaried. Matter of fact, some of them are being, because they even suggested before that this individual who, as I said before, first in his class at West Point, first in his class at Harvard Law School, Harvard Law Review, CIA director, member of Congress, entrepreneur, who actually deserved more than the 66 votes he got last time, but we'll leave that where that is because some people just routinely vote against individuals like that. But this time did pass, but only by 4 votes. And it just shows me again how politicized everything has been. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But let me, while I was just mentioning this migrant caravan that is going to cross over in Tijuana to San Diego, there is also some legal action there, and that is the battle over what is to happen with what is called DACA. This is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, has been heating up once again. And I'm going to read from Matt Vespa, but one of the pieces we'll probably talk about tomorrow since I have Jeremy Dice with us. And because he actually is with First Liberty, I want to look at some of the legal issues. But Andrew McCarthy's piece, which we will probably post tomorrow, but I'll quote from it now, says that this ruling from District Judge John Bates in the DACA case is absurd because it says that what we had is a lawlessly imposed executive order. That's the executive order imposed by President Barack Obama, who admitted, at least years earlier, if not even months earlier, that he could not do this, and then went ahead and did it. So it was something even he admitted he didn't have authority to do. But again, what Andrew McCarthy says is that this judge is basically saying that what was lawlessly imposed by executive order may not be lawfully rescinded by executive order. So because Barack Obama did it, even though it wasn't constitutional, that's okay. And now because President Donald Trump wants to rescind it and use the legal means to do so, that's not okay. So this is the upside-down world that we live in. And back to the piece by Matt Vesta, in which he was simply saying, like crabgrass, this issue of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, keeps arising, causing headaches for the Trump administration. The Trump White House decided to gradually phase out the constitutionally questionable program, effectively rescinding an executive order issued by former President Barack Obama, which I just mentioned. And he says, yet politically, they couldn't leave almost 1 million illegal aliens subject to immediate deportation. Of course, the political consequences would be too great. So they added, that is they, meaning really the Trump administration, added a 6-month enforcement delay, giving Congress time to actually pass a DACA fix. And you'd say, well, then they had 6 months. Why didn't they do it? Well, Matt Vesta points out that that's because Democrats weren't going to play ball, as he puts it. There was the best option since close to a dozen state attorney generals threatened to sue the Trump administration should they do nothing on DACA. White House lawyers felt rightly that they couldn't defend the law in court, so here we are. Failed fixes for DACA, that is, again, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. A government shutdown for a few days, if you might remember, over illegal aliens. And then the Democrats turning down the legalization of 1.8 million illegals, putting them on a pathway to citizenship in exchange for border wall funding. But because there was supposed to be a trade, a compromise, okay, we will certainly legalize or provide a path to citizenship for these 1.8 million, which is more than what was talked about, because most people usually talk about a third of those. But I'll leave that on the table. Just for exchange for border wall funding, that was a deal breaker, and so we are where we are, in part because the Democrats don't want to compromise with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump won't do something unless he got some kind of funding for the border wall. And since the most recent budget, interestingly enough, has nothing for the border wall, that debate will continue on. So here we are. Now you have a federal district court judge who's basically saying you can't shut down a program that was created illegally in the first place. So welcome to America in the 21st century. Let me move on to some other topics. There are so many to cover, but I thought for just a minute I might talk a little bit about French President Emmanuel Macron, who spoke to Congress. And on some of the things that he had to say, he sounded as much like a Republican as anything. On other points, he sounded very much like a French president. When he talked about liberty, when he talked about freedom, when he talked about certainly focusing on how we can bring freedom to the global community, he sounded like somebody that might have had his speech written by Donald Trump's speechwriter. But then there were a couple of places where he obviously received some cheers from the Democratic side of the aisle. Up until that point, some of the Democrats had sat on their hands and the Republicans were cheering. But one had to do with the Iran deal. He says that the international nuclear deal with Iran is something that needs to be implemented and not withdrawn. He said it is true to say that this agreement may not address all concerns and very important concerns, but we should not abandon it without having something more substantial instead. So he said, that's my position. And so that was one of the points that he made. Then he also expressed his concern not only about Donald Trump wanting to withdraw from the Iran deal, but also to withdraw from the Paris Accords. You knew he was going to say something about that. The Paris Accords in France, climate change, big issue, of course. And so, again, what he said is, let us work together in order to make our planet great again. I love that turn of phrase. You know, after all, Donald Trump talks about making America great again. So, of course, you know, you got to love President Macron by saying, let's make our planet great again. We're killing our planet. Let's face it, there is no planet B. And so that was one of the other comments that he had to make there as well. And then his visit was also an effort to try to convince President Donald Trump to exempt Europe from steel tariffs, and also to convince the United States to maintain its military presence in Syria. And so these are some of the conversations we've had in the past. But nevertheless, this was time to hear from Europe, and we did. And in some respects, I don't think some of the Democratic senators and members of the House of Representatives were prepared for hearing a speech which, until he got to the issues of Iran and climate change, sounded more like Donald Trump than it did like Barack Obama. But nevertheless, that was kind of one of those interesting issues that was front and center. And one of the topics that we were going to address yesterday in the Millennial Roundtable, I thought I'd mention a little bit here, and we'll get to it after the break. And it has to do with this very sad commentary of what is happening to this child, 2 years old, Alfie Evans, who finds himself in, the stages of death, an undiagnosed brain condition that has really robbed him of most of his function. The prognosis is not good. We understand that. And matter of fact, I probably need to check and see if he's still even alive. But the argument, whether he's alive or not, is that the people in England said they were not going to allow his parents to transfer him from a British hospital to an Italian hospital to seek experimental care. Now, you might say, well, why? I mean, certainly they would have the freedom to do that. No, this is what, again, we need to talk about, especially as we come even to these midterm elections. You're going to hear more and more people saying, we just need Medicare for all, which is a nice way of saying we need to have the government take over the healthcare system. Basically, it's called Medicare for all. Most people like Medicare, but you could just as easily call it the VA for all, the Veterans Administration for all. And that was not so positive, because you would say, well, if they are parents and they have the right over their child, they should be able to take their child to Italy. It probably is not going to work. Experimental care probably isn't going to be effective, but let's let them make that decision. Oh, no, we can't let them make that decision, because you can't leave the healthcare system. And so it's just an illustration of some of the conversation that will not only happen during the midterms, but especially will be part of the next presidential election. Most of the Democratic candidates pretty much now have accepted Bernie Sanders' view of a single payer, a government-run healthcare system. And so if you want to understand what that looks like, all you have to do is look at the British health system and look what is happening right now to poor Alfie Evans. And we'll talk more about that and the whole question of, really, who controls your kids? It's a good question. Ben Shapiro asked about that question, and we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue your conversation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talked a little bit about everything from the NFL to the immigration caravan, and then some of the comments by French President Emmanuel Macron. And I wanted to come back to this issue of what has happened and is happening right now to Alfie Evans, because there's a good piece by Ben Shapiro, and I might post it tomorrow if we get to that conversation, because he says and asks a good question: who controls your kids' lives? And he starts out with a story from former Senator Phil Gramm of Texas. And he's got the story different than the way I've heard it. So the next time we have Phil Gramm on the program, I'm going to have Phil Gramm clarify it. Because the way I heard it was Phil Gramm was actually talking about the health care issue when we had Hillary Care, and where somebody was saying, well, I know your kids as well as you do. And he, of course, then puts them on the spot. The story that Ben Shapiro has, and they may both be true, they may have happened at different times, but here he said that Phil Gramm was actually speaking out on the issue of educational reform, and he had said that my educational policies are based on the fact that I care more about my children than you do. And Phil Gramm says, well, one woman said, no, you don't. I've heard it also that a bureaucrat said it don't. And so then Phil Gramm looked at her and said, okay, what are their names? Because the point is you know the names of your kids, you know the needs of your kids better than anybody else. And yet, as he says, Ben Shapiro says, Phil Gramm's fundamental premise is unalterably correct. Parents care more about their children than do the members of the bureaucracy, but parents are being gradually curbed in their authority by precisely those bureaucrats across the West. And so, interestingly enough, it points out that 2 days ago, a British court actually condemned a 2-year-old child to die. This is Alfie Evans. You know, what's it all about, Alfie? You might remember that. But this is a different Alfie in this case. And he is probably going to die, may have anyway if they had transferred him. But the parents simply wanted to have the ability to transfer their child from a British hospital to an Italian hospital that's working on experimental care. And the British court system refused. And interestingly enough, Ben Shapiro goes on to say that citing the expertise of Evans' doctors, the courts declared that Evans' best interests are not served by his parents attempting to save his life. What? Yeah, well, that's where it went. Instead, the little boy would be deprived of life support, left to die without oxygen or water. The ruling, the judge said, represents the final chapter in the life of this extraordinary little boy. Thank you, Judge, but no, it's just hard to even understand this. And this is not a country that is run by a dictator, authoritarian rule, unless you happen to believe that the British health system is that, and then, of course, it is. And so this is a chapter written, as Ben Shapiro says, by the British bureaucracy, not by his parents, the ones who will have to engrave his epitaph and visit his grave. And he said this appalling result isn't the first of its kind. Last year, you might remember another child. Who was that? That was Charlie Gard. And he was taken off life support again due to what? The British court system, which prevented his parents from sending him to the United States for further treatment. Again, the courts made the final argument that the best interest of the child lay in his death. Ben Shapiro goes on to say all of this is the final result of a system of thought that places parental control of children below the expertise of bureaucrats on the scale of priorities. It's one thing for the government to step in when parents are preventing children from receiving life care treatment. There are some times we recognize the government has to step in. Got that. Everybody understands that. And those are pretty rare, by the way. It's another when the government steps in to prevent parents from pursuing potential life-saving care, and yet that's just what has happened repeatedly in the United Kingdom. And so you might say, why? I mean, really, what do they have to lose? If the parents want to spend their money to take Charlie Gard with them to the United States, they're spending their money. If these other parents wanted to take Alfie Evans, using their money, to go to Italy, why would the British court system care? Well, that's why I think it's important to begin to understand that. And Ben Shapiro gives this answer. He says, because a bureaucratic society of experts generally sees parents as an obstacle to proper development. Parents in this view treat their children as chattel to be owned and trained, but the state can treat children with dignity they are due. This means placing parental wishes to the side in every case in which those wishes come into conflict with the priorities of the state. The bureaucrats of Britain don't merely usurp parental rights in the realm of life and death. They do so in the realm of upbringing as well. They have threatened religious Jewish schools for failing to inculcate children with LGBT propaganda. Meanwhile, they've ignored the targeting of young women in Rotterdam and Oxford and Newcastle because the perpetrators are disproportionately Muslim. And he said, all of this is untenable, both morally and practically. Parents will not continue to give the power to control their children away to bureaucrats who do not know their children's names. Back to the story of Phil Graham. And I think what we have to understand is it's not just the British government that wants control over the kids. It is the British health system that cannot allow people to escape the system, because the concept of a single-payer plan is that everybody's in the system. And then when you're in the system, we will decide whether you can spend more money or whether we can spend scarce medical resources on individuals. And so really the big questions are at the two ends of life. It is interesting because there is a man by the name of Ezekiel Emanuel, and that last name may sound familiar because his brother is the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel. And Ezekiel Emanuel has put together some various graphs, and I've posted these before. I think there's still one even on my Pinterest, and I think there's some that we've even had on our Facebook pages, of a graph that shows almost looks like a bell-shaped curve. And the point he's making is this. At the beginning of life and at the end of life, sometimes we spend too much on health care. The beginning of life, we have a child that's born with any kind of genetic defects, in this case, mental defects. And so we shouldn't spend scarce medical resources on those individuals because we could spend them more effectively on people that are healthy. And at the other end of life, then the same thing. After about the age of 65, certainly after the age of 75, a lot of health care dollars are spent on those individuals. And so the argument that comes from Ezekiel Emanuel, who was one of the architects of Obamacare, was that if we're going to be effectively using scarce medical resources and scarce medical dollars, the best way is to focus as much as we can on those individuals that are going to give us the biggest bang for the buck. And so if a child reaches the age of 3 or 4, certainly by the age of 5, and they're healthy, I'd rather spend money on them with health care dollars because they may live to the age of 85. And so we're putting just a little bit of health care dollars into them along the way, treating them for colds, inoculating them, whatever. And they're going to give us tremendous benefits to the society. But if we have individuals that are too chronically ill before that age, we really have to think about whether or not we want to spend health care dollars on them. Likewise, by the time somebody gets to be about 65, or I've seen some of them use the number 75, so whatever, those individuals now, we're going to spend lots of money on them, trying to keep them alive when their productivity for this society is virtually nil. And so there's no value in spending it there. Well, if this sounds familiar, you've probably heard this before. There were countries, Germany's a good example, where they said, maybe we just need to get rid of useless eaters. Well, this isn't quite as crass. It's not saying, well, we need to put them to death, but we certainly should not spend scarce medical dollars on them, so eventually nature takes its course and they die off. And so you can see where a lot of this comes from. And so, again, you can understand why some of these decisions have come down from the British healthcare system, because it's a single-payer system. But you still might be thinking, well, yeah, but, okay, we're not talking about spending the tax dollars of British citizens. These people want to spend their most of them, in many cases, all of them, want to spend their dollars. Yeah, but once you leave the system, then there's just too many outs. The goal is to keep people in the system, make sure everybody has health care. Not quality health care, just health care. And so even allowing parents to spend their own dollars to take a child somewhere else just doesn't seem to be in the best interest of the British healthcare system. And so this is something to keep in the back of your mind when you ask some of these particular candidates over the next couple of months, what do you think about whether we should repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare? What do you think we should do about health care? And when they start saying, well, I think we just need Medicare for all, we know what that looks like. Just look to Britain, look to Canada. And again, if you have a cold or a sinus infection, great. If you need a heart transplant, you may just be out of luck, especially if you're too old or if you have too many diseases because you're too young. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Father Joseph LaFleur served the Army Air Corps as chaplain during World War II. In 1941, LaFleur dashed about Clark Field in the Philippines amidst bombs and flying shrapnel, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. For such bravery, the Army Air Corps awarded Chaplain LaFleur the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross. Later, while imprisoned by the Japanese for 3 years, he never stopped his ministry of care. He worked to meet the physical needs of his fellow prisoners, often bartering with guards for food. Once he confronted a fellow prisoner about stealing rations from other prisoners, even landing 2 holy punches to pacify the unruly and unrepentant soldier. In 1944, a U.S. submarine torpedoed LaFleur's prisoner transport ship. Rather than abandon ship or seek to escape Japanese gunfire and grenades lobbed in his direction, the chaplain worked to calm his men and to help them find an escape passage. Chaplain LaFleur died as he lived, in faithful service to his fellow man. Motivated by faith to care for their fellow man, chaplains in our nation's service routinely steady our servicemen and women before, during, and after battle. Military chaplains navigate the evils of war to bring good to our military. We honor Chaplain LaFleur and all chaplains for their dedication to the souls of our armed forces. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes before we get to the top of the hour, and I might just mention next hour, going to spend some time talking about a few of the articles we've posted on the website. I kind of review a few things that we've talked about in terms of immigration, but then move on to a piece by Ben Shapiro, who I just quoted from, Intellectual Refuseniks and Renegades. And it's been interesting to see that I'll be quoting from a number of individuals that we disagree with theologically and sometimes politically. But nevertheless, Sam Harris, an individual with the so-called new atheist, Jordan Peterson, who, again, kind of a secular-minded psychologist, and a variety of other individuals that fit into that discussion are actually causing a lot of people on the left to disconnect with them, I guess would be a way to say that, or to criticize them or to vilify them, depending on which particular Twitter post you look at or which particular Facebook post. And it's so interesting because some of these individuals are willing to actually pay the price because they're tired of political correctness. They're tired of having to be told that you have to follow the company line, the politically correct line. And, of course, you could add to that a couple of other individuals that this week have been under fire. Kanye West is one of many who fit into that category. So it's just interesting, and so we'll talk about that. Also get into the idea of politically motivated violence is on the rise. That's a real concern as well. And then a little bit later in the third hour, we're going to spend some time talking about the Bible and America with Jerry Newcombe. And so even though this third hour is not broadcast in Dallas, you can certainly watch it online or visit our website or go to Facebook. And then we're going to be talking about the National Day of Prayer with Ronnie Floyd. That's going to be a good interview as well. So lots to cover in the next few hours. So if you'd like to join us at any point, feel free to join us. And if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, 1-800-351-1212. I did want to get into the subject of education for one reason, and that is it has occurred to me that oftentimes when we've done some of these programs on the subject of education, those have been in the third hour. And those are heard on the national program but are not heard here in Dallas. And just the other day, we had Ray on to talk about some of those issues when we talked about Exodus mandate. And we've had Lance Izumi on to talk about the corruption in the classroom. And so whether we're looking at what Ray Moore talks about in terms of some of the educational performance, whether we look at what Lance Izumi talks about in terms of some of the other problems, you can see that we've got what many people are referring to as educational fraud. And so it was interesting to see that yesterday Walter Williams wrote about this. Walter Williams has been on the program with us before. It's been a while, and is a professor that really looks at these issues, certainly as a professor at George Mason University, writing on all of these topics, but also because he's an African-American, perhaps even more feels this because he's so concerned about what some of this educational fraud has done to the black community. So he points out that earlier this month, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which essentially is the nation's report card, and I'll just call it NAEP, stands for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the nation's report card, found this. Only 37% of 12th graders tested proficient or better in reading. In other words, just a little bit more than a third of 12th graders are able to read and understand at the 12th grade level. Does that bother you at all? Only a third. And then only 25% did so in math, so 1/4. So that means 3/4 are not proficient in math, and 2/3 are not proficient in English. It's worse, as Walter Williams likes to point out, for our black students. Only 17% tested proficient or better in reading, and just 7% reached a level of proficiency in math. And he says the atrocious NAEP performance is only a fraction of the bad news. Nationally, our high school graduation rate is over 80%. That means high school diplomas, which attest to these students and supposedly suggest these students can read and compute at the 12th grade level, are conferred when 63% are not proficient in reading and 75% are not proficient in math. Of course, he says for the blacks, the news is even worse because we've already given you some of those numbers. And so then Walter Williams goes on in another paragraph to say, fraudulent high school diplomas aren't the worst part of the fraud. Some of the greatest fraud occurs at the higher education levels, colleges and universities. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 70% of white high school graduates in 2016 enrolled in college, and 58% of black high school graduates enrolled in college. And here are my questions to you. If only 37% of white high school graduates test at college ready, how come colleges are admitting 70% of them? And the answer is they're just simply going along with the system. He says it's inconceivable that college administrators are unaware that they're admitting students who are ill-prepared and that they are admitting students who cannot perform at the college level. Colleges cope with ill-prepared students in several ways. They provide remedial courses. One study suggests that more than 2/3 of community college students take at least one remedial course, as do 40% of four-year college students. College professors dumb down their courses so that ill-prepared students can get passing grades. And colleges also set up majors with little analytical demands so that as to accommodate students with analytical deficits. Such majors also include the term studies, such as ethnic studies, cultural studies, gender studies, and American studies. The major for the most ill-prepared student, sadly enough, is education. While students' SAT scores are ranked by intended majors, education majors place 26th on a list of 38. And so he says the bottom line is that colleges are admitting youngsters who have not mastered what used to be considered a 9th grade level of proficiency in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Very often they graduate from college, they can't even master even a 12th grade level of academic proficiency. And the problem is worse in college sports. Since we started the conversation talking about the NFL, let's talk about NCAA. And at the University of North Carolina, a learning special hired to help athletes found that during the period from 2004 to 2012, 60% of the members of the football and basketball teams read between the 4th and 8th grade levels, and about 10% read below the 3rd grade level. Keep in mind that all of these athletes both graduated from high school and were admitted to college. So again, he begins to then ask the other question, how necessary is college anyway? One estimate is 1 in 3 college graduates have a job historically performed by those with a high school diploma. And according to Richard Vedder, who we've talked about on this program before, emeritus professor now of economics at Ohio University and the director of Center for College Affordability and Productivity, said that there were 115,000 janitors, 16,000 parking lot attendants, 83,000 bartenders, and 35,000 taxi drivers with a bachelor's degree. Read it and weep. And for those of you that are parents sending kids off to college, might want to rethink some of that as well. So one of the issues that certainly has caused a lot of parents to rethink public education is this. And, of course, that just is talking about academic performance, not all the conversation we had with Lance Azumi about all sorts of other issues, not just academic fraud, but financial mismanagement and fraud and bullying and comprehensive sex education and all sorts of other issues that are part and parcel of why many parents are taking their kids out of the public schools and either homeschooling them or putting them in Christian schools. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. 1 hour down, 2 to go. So if you'd like to know some of the things that we've been talking about today, they're available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We have a lot to cover in this hour, and then in the second hour, I might just mention we're going to be talking with our friend Jerry Newcombe about the influence of the Bible in the history of America. It's entitled Confessions of a Christian Constitutionalist, and then we'll end the program by talking with Ronnie Floyd, who is the head of the National Day of Prayer this year, so we'll talk about that as well. But in this first hour, I want to get into a couple of issues. We have a caravan of migrants that are about ready to cross the border from Mexico to the United States, and a judge that has ruled that President Donald Trump has to restart the DACA program, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, within the next 90 days. So we'll get into some of the immigration issues. Then one of the articles I've posted is called Intellectual Refuseniks and Renegades. It's been interesting to see how many of these people that would be liberal and secular, matter of fact, many of them call themselves atheists, nevertheless are coming to some conclusions that we've been talking about here on Point of View for some time. Also, politically motivated violence is on the rise, so we'll get into that. Also might mention a little bit about the story of Alfie Evans in England, simply because of the fact that his parents wanted to take him from the UK, that is England, to Italy to actually get experimental treatment, and they were denied. You may remember Charlie Gard. The parents wanted to remove him from England and bring him to the United States. They were denied there as well, so we'll get into some of that. And a little bit later, we'll talk about a couple of issues in the Mueller investigation and the rest. But let me bring you up to speed on a couple of stories that have just broken within the last hour. First of all, Mike Pompeo has been confirmed by the U.S. Senate by a vote of 54 to 41. Now, if you've listened to this program over the last week or so, we've pointed out that this is a very qualified individual. First in his class at West Point, and certainly first in his class at Harvard Law School, and was the Harvard Law Review editor, so very qualified, an entrepreneur, a man that served in Congress and then was confirmed as CIA director, where he serves at the moment. And this time, he was threatened and challenged in the Foreign Relations Committee in the United States Senate. And again, last time received 66 votes, which I think were still low, simply because there are some Democrats who will vote against any Republican, no matter who they are, no matter how qualified they are. This time it's 54, so that means 12 more Democrats decided to abandon ship, because if nothing else, by supporting somebody that Donald Trump supports, they would be primaried, and they don't want to have to deal with that. Of course, some of them are going to be anyway, so we'll see how that plays itself out. But anyway, Mike Pompeo, an individual who I think will bring quite a bit of expertise to the position of Secretary of State, has been confirmed. And as we said last week, I think Dr. Merrill Matthews had it right when he said, let's just be honest, over the last couple of months here, we've had two extremes. As much as some of our people around the round table like Rex Tillerson, let's at least acknowledge that Rex Tillerson was probably one of the least qualified people to serve as Secretary of State. It's not mean that he's not qualified. He certainly ran a Fortune 10 company, Exxon, and did that with distinguished ability. But he didn't have a lot of what you might call foreign policy experience, but he brought that expertise to the State Department. And so he was confirmed overwhelmingly, even though he may not have been as qualified, when you come to Mike Pompeo, you may have a man who was maybe the most qualified of anyone we've ever had to serve as Secretary of State. I mean, really. Somebody who has been in Congress and then is now the CIA director coming into the State Department. Do you think he has a pretty good idea of all of the things happening in terms of the world, in terms of security issues? I think so. And again, to only get 54 votes is not a reflection on him, but it is a reflection on, sadly, the number of those individuals who could simply not bring themselves to vote for him. So that's one of those stories. And while we're talking about a vote, the vote has come in, and Bill Cosby has been convicted of drugging and molesting a woman. And this is in the first trial, really, if you think about it, it's the first celebrity trial in the Me Too era. And we talked about Me Too just the other day. And so we'll see what happens. Of course, there's going to be an appeal. But if indeed this stands, Bill Cosby could spend up to 10 years in prison on each of the counts. And as I understand it, I think there's 3 counts. So that's pretty intriguing. So if nothing else, something else that has been unfolding in the so-called Me Too era. Let me move our attention, though, to the southern border of the United States, and in particular, the southern border of the state of California. Hundreds of Central American migrants from a caravan that has crossed Mexico, and we've been talking about them for some time, have now reunited in Tijuana yesterday, and they plan to cross the border over the weekend in defiance of some of the threats issued by President Donald Trump to repel them. The timing of the migrants arrive at a time when it could really threaten some of the talks related to what's called NAFTA. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which Donald Trump has talked about threatening to scrap if Mexico does not crack down on the flow of Central American migrants through the territory. And it turns out that this busload of migrants, we've been following this for some time. We've talked about this on Point of View, began arriving on Tuesday at a shelter that's really about a 5-minute walk from the border. It's within sight of one of the U.S. flags that you can see. If you've ever been to San Diego, Tijuana, you kind of know what I'm talking about there. And so they've been resting in the tents, but some of them have wandered up to the border just to contemplate what they're going to do. One individual said, well, that wall doesn't look that tall. I really want to cross it. And that's an individual from Honduras. And, of course, many of them, as I've mentioned on this program before, left their homes in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, because of all sorts of issues, economic difficulties, local gangs, all political persecution, all sorts of things. And they've been sort of moving from town to town. And then the argument was that maybe they would go to Mexico City and the caravan would disperse. Well, I guess not. And so many of them have been put together by a group called Pueblos Sin Fronteras, which again is, the idea of having no borders that will actually take place and actually protect the citizens of any particular country. And you have to understand that the border of Mexico to those Latin American countries usually is manned, but when many of these individuals in the caravan got to that border crossing, there was nobody there. So this is why President Trump has said, Mexico, if you were actually to do what you should be doing, then we wouldn't have to be doing what we're doing. It's one thing to even try to protect our border from people in Mexico that want to cross it, but you have allowed people to cross from these Latin American countries, these Central American countries, into Mexico, and you've done nothing to really stop them as well. And now they have gathered in Tijuana. So I predict, without a doubt, we're going to have all sorts of discussions and news stories about that over the weekend. When we come back from the break, I want to talk also about this decision that came down from a judge that says that the president needs to restart the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The congressional hearings with Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg mostly focused on data collection and privacy. Fortunately, Senator Ted Cruz also raised important questions about what he called a pervasive pattern of bias and political censorship. And Senator Ben Sasse said he thought America might be better off not being policed by one company that has a really big and powerful platform. He even asked the founder if he could define hate speech. It turns out that censorship by Facebook is more than just incidental, and the problem of censorship is more pervasive. All of the big tech companies engage in censorship. Here are just a few examples. Facebook shut down the Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day page and has blocked a post by Fox News reporter Todd Starnes. Apparently, over 24 Catholic pages have been blocked. And, of course, the most recent example was the decision by Facebook about the African-American ladies known as Diamond and Silk, who Facebook considered unsafe for the community. Lots of people have had Twitter pull down their comments. For example, Representative Marsha Blackburn was blocked on Twitter because of her statement that I fought Planned Parenthood and we stopped the sale of baby body parts. Twitter shut down her video ad campaign, claiming it was inflammatory and negative. Speaking on videos, there's a lot of censorship at YouTube. Videos by pro-life groups have been removed. Dennis Prager and Prager University filed to stop YouTube from censoring their videos. A California federal judge dismissed their complaint. And in previous commentaries, I've talked about how Apple removed Chuck Colson's Manhattan Declaration from its iTunes App Store, and there are other religious apps that have also been removed. Each of these big tech giants portrays themselves as a neutral public forum. There is growing evidence of their bias and censorship. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Lots of conversations to talk about today. One of those, of course, is immigration. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Hundreds of Central American migrants massing at the border of California and Mexico right there in Tijuana, plan to cross the border. Love to get your comments. What should we do? Just simply let them in and give them a path to citizenship? Should we turn them back? Should we put border guards there? Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Of course, the other part of that is what to do with individuals that are already here. And that gets into the decision that came down from the Judge John Bates, federal district court in the District of Columbia, that actually says, President Trump, you have 90 days to restart DACA, which is called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Now, let's admit that this was actually created in a constitutionally questionable way. Is that fair to say? Matter of fact, tomorrow we're going to have a more significant discussion about the legal issues surrounding this. Jeremy Dice will be with us of First Liberty, and one of the articles I'm going to post by Andrew McCarthy, and I love how he starts it out. He said the absurd ruling by District Judge John Bates, which means that what is lawlessly imposed by executive order, that would be what was imposed by under President Barack Obama, but what means what was lawlessly imposed by executive order may not be lawfully rescinded by executive order. That would be the executive order by Donald Trump. Think about that for a minute. We'll get into that more in terms of the legal issues in just a minute. But this is, of course, a big issue that has been front and center for many months and now for more than a couple of years, if you go all the way back to when the DACA program was first initiated by President Barack Obama. because we recognize that the Trump administration could not leave 1 million illegal aliens subject to immediate deportation. Of course, the political consequences would be too great. So the decision that came down from President Trump was to actually enforce and implement a 6-month delay. Since it was beginning to phase out, let's give Congress 6 months to come up with a reasonable resolution of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Okay, let me give you a little bit of history. We first of all have the failed DACA fixes. Then you had, for a short period of time, even a government shutdown over this issue of DACA and illegal aliens. And then you had a proposal by President Donald Trump to actually provide for the legalization of 1.8 million of these individuals and even put them on a pathway to citizenship. But the Democratic leadership rejected it. Why? Because he wanted to do that in exchange for a border wall, some kind of funding for border wall. Well, that did not happen. The current spending, it's not a budget, but some people erroneously call it a budget, but the current spending doesn't allow that either. And so here we are, now a federal judge saying that DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, needs to be restarted, although he gave the Department of Homeland Security 3 months to better elaborate on why the program should actually be removed. So we'll see where that goes. But once again, this issue of DACA is in the courts. But more significant is the possibility of hundreds of Central American migrants in a caravan crossing Mexico. They have come from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and they are going to cross into the San Diego area this weekend. And I'd love to get your comments about that as well. First article I've posted, though, is one that I've kind of been following for a while. Of course, if you've ever listened to this program, we sometimes talk about the so-called new atheist, and Sam Harris is one of those. Well, recently I've been seeing all sorts of pieces showing up about Jordan Peterson. Matter of fact, I even mentioned his name yesterday. And Ben Shapiro wrote a very good piece. It's entitled "Leftists Loathe Sam Harris, I should say, Jordan Peterson and other naysayers, but their audience is growing." And he points out that 2 weeks ago, the philosopher and neuroscientist Sam Harris had Ezra Klein, who is the Vox editor-in-chief, on his podcast, Waking Up, and the topic was the whole issue of the fact that his website had labeled Harris a participant in pseudoscience because Sam Harris had the temerity to actually allow Charles Murray to be on his program. Now, if you're not familiar, Charles Murray has been on this program once or twice over these 40 years that this broadcast has existed. And he wrote a book called The Bell Curve that looks at IQ differentials among different population groups. Well, of course, that gets you in trouble immediately, because as soon as you suggest there may be a different racial component, and there is, I mean, you don't have to argue that. You look, for example, at Ashkenazi Jews, and their IQ is significantly higher than the median. You can go all the way up and down various racial groups, and that really is the case. But nevertheless, that, of course, gets you in all sorts of trouble. And, of course, you've had all sorts of individuals that have protested Charles Murray, actually put him in some kind of danger. You had the Antifa hoodlums break up the lecture that he had at Middlebury College and injure one of the professors there, who actually had to be in a dark room for about a week, and all sorts of stuff. But nevertheless, the point is, they're saying, and again, Ben Shapiro says, Harris, like Murray, was cast out of good graces of the left just a few years ago, because in 2014, he pointed out that Islam is more of a threat to the peace of humanity than Christianity is. And if you've never seen that piece, it is fascinating, because it is actually a roundtable discussion in which Sam Harris said Islam at the moment is the motherlode of bad ideas. Well, one of the other participants is Ben Affleck, who just goes nuts over this statement or two, and says that what Harris said was gross, that it was racist. Harris, by contrast, explained, we have been sold this meme of Islamophobia, where every critique of the doctrine of Islam gets conflated with bigotry towards Muslims as people, and that's just intellectually ridiculous. And so Sam Harris, as he points out, isn't the only leftist to have found himself intellectually homeless, and that is you have a growing population of others that are that way as well. And one example that he uses is Brett Weinstein, who I've talked about before. Interestingly enough, he used to be part of Occupy Wall Street, and he calls himself a deeply progressive. I'm so liberal that I'm to the left of liberals, okay? And he's been a professor at Evergreen State College. But nevertheless, he's become the persona non grata with the leftists because he refused to bow to some of the identity politics at Evergreen College, which said you should take a day off on the so-called day of absence at Evergreen, and so as a result found himself excommunicated from the liberal fold as well. And then he says those who have been cast out of the good graces of liberal intelligentsia include such others as Jordan Peterson. And if you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, a couple of weeks ago, somebody said, you got to see some of those videos. And so lately I've been watching some of the YouTube videos. And again, I appreciate the incredible amount of common sense. Again, not anybody that would be able to sign the doctrinal statement of your church, but nevertheless, quite recently has gained a great deal of attention as well, because he said, I'm really tired of all of these politically correct attempts to help people and this idea of coming up with these transgender pronouns. He said, I'm just never going to use those words. And, of course, has also debated feminists and a variety of other individuals, really from a liberal leftist point of view. But once you use common sense, you find how many times you hear them saying things that you would really agree with. And so, anyway, the point that Ben Shapiro is talking about is that they all actually fit what he calls the Bartleby effect. Herman Melville has a story about Bartleby the Scrivener in which he said, I would not do this, and I won't go into all the details, but he basically says that sometimes we're drawn to people that in the midst of what might seem like just kind of political correct insanity, stand up and say, I'm not going to have any more of it. And so the point he's making, and you can read the entire articles because I've only summarized kind of the first 2 pages, is that you're having more and more individuals, people that would not necessarily call themselves conservatives, people that would never call themselves Christians, most of whom are atheists, most of whom are very liberal, but they've had enough of this political correctness, and they actually begin to exercise their brains, use a little bit of common sense, and come to some of the positions we've talked about for decades here on Point of View. So I thought it would be an interesting piece for you to read, and we have posted that on the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. I'd love to get some of your comments. We've talked about everything from immigration as well as some of the decisions coming down on the next Secretary of State, and even people standing up against political correctness. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, one of the things we talk about is the lack of civility, and I think there are a number of people that have been writing about that, but Jim Garrity in his piece, Politically Motivated Violence is on the Rise. No doubt about that. You can justify it in a number of ways, but I thought it was interesting because he gives at least some reasons why that might be taking place, and he points out that in 2003, Chris Hedges wrote a book entitled War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. I love what he says. You can probably get the gist of his perspective from his 2008 book, American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. And still, he says there's some truth in the title. Think of all the martial metaphors we use to describe the ups and downs of life. We're in a battle. We're charging forward. We're crusading for a cause. We're chasing a goal. We're fighting for our beliefs. We're taking a beating. We're getting flack. Our proposal is shot down. We've reached a ceasefire. The new idea represents a revolution. And he says, you know, perhaps politics is another force that gives many Americans meaning. It gives them an enemy, a target, a focus for all of their worst impulses and feelings. Very few of us can completely escape the temptation to feel hate, contempt, disdain, and desire for someone else. Politics gives us a target and an excuse. Now, first of all, Jim Garrity's not looking at it from a Christian point of view, but I am. And I say, you know, first of all, we are to love our enemies. So from a Christian point of view, we would reject that. But you can understand in a world that has rejected kind of biblical ideas, why today, in some respects, politics is beginning to give people a justification for doing what might be violent acts. I mean, I talked about Antifa just a minute ago, or Antifa, depending on how you want to pronounce that particular group. And he says, you know, you'll say, see over there, these people are not just mistaken or wrong. They're trying to destroy this country, or as Hillary puts it, they're a basket of deplorables. So if you go from a time in which, well, I just disagree with you, to the fact that you are wrong and you are dangerous and I have a right to destroy you, you can see how some of that has developed. And one of the examples he uses is from the Connecticut governor, who, by the way, has been in the news today with the Wall Street Journal because they're talking about how Connecticut is just has virtually no growth because of all the various tax increases. But anyway, the Connecticut governor there decreed, quote, the NRA acts like a terrorist organization. And then he actually has defended that label because he says the organization uses fear to coerce. I love what Jim Garrity says. No word on whether the governor believes labeling other group of terrorists as using fear to coerce as well. As I've said before, when we start labeling groups as terrorists, or when we label them as racist, or this person is Hitler, when everybody's Hitler, nobody's Hitler. When everybody's a racist, nobody's a racist. When you say that a legal organization, which is populated by a lot of really good people, many of whom have been on this program, and others that serve in the military and in law enforcement, when you call the organization a terrorist organization, the words don't even have any meaning anymore. But it gives you a justification for hurting them, and this has been the problem, is that now there are individuals that have actually justified beginning to hurt these individuals. Because he says if you vandalize somebody's house for the sake of vandalism, you're just a punk. But if the human mind's capacity for self-justification is remarkable, this gets into this story of what happened to the Cox family. Now, if you have been following the National Rifle Association, one of the individuals who actually deals with some of the NRA legislation is a man by the name of Chris Cox. Well, what you have here are individuals that now have actually done things to the home, and the argument made by those people is that, well, that is Chris Cox, is profiting off murders and suicides, and so as a result is really encouraging supporters to use armed intimidation against the home of one of the people who is involved in the legislative activities of the National Rifle Association. And so Jim Garrity goes on to say, let's tease this statement out a bit. There's no evidence that the NRA's Chris Cox is actually profiting off of murders and suicides. If he was, law enforcement would be pressing charges. What the protesters mean is they're really angry about gun violence, and they are angry that Cox disagrees with their desire to see private ownership of firearms banned. There's no real deny that throwing fake blood on the home of Cox and his family doesn't constitute a crime of vandalism. But their defense is the tactic is warranted under the circumstances, that Cox deserves to be a victim of a crime because he disagrees with the protesters. So the point I'm making is, and Chris Cox will, of course, be in this Dallas area next week because the national convention of the National Rifle Association will take place just a few miles away from the studio. It will be interesting to see what he has to say about that. But again, it shows a lack of civility, but it shows one more step, and that is if indeed I not only disagree with this person, but see them as dangerous, then they should be a victim of my vandalism or even of my aggression because they don't deserve to be treated fairly. And this is the war that is starting to come to a lot of people's homes and something we need to pay attention to. Let me, before we take a break, also at least acknowledge that something we were going to talk about yesterday in our Millennial Roundtable did not take place, but I did want to mention the plight of Alfie Evans, and he is the 2-year-old in England. His parents have wanted him to actually be moved from England and from the British hospital to an Italian hospital to seek experimental care. Well, as you may know, the court turned him down, and this is not the first time. You might remember in the past we've talked about the circumstances of Charlie Gard, who was taken off of life support, but in this case, the parents wanted to take him from England to the United States. And the sad reality is that the court in every one of these cases, whether it's been Alfie Evans or Charlie Gard, is that we believe that this is in the best interest of the child to allow that child to die. You could stop there, but I won't, because it, I think, illustrates a point that we need to pay attention to during this political campaign. And that is, there are those individuals that want to move the United States healthcare system one step further to what you might call a single-payer plan. And that single-payer plan is oftentimes portrayed as Medicare for all. The reason they use that is most people tend to think Medicare works pretty well. But, of course, you have to recognize people pay into Medicare so they receive benefits from it. If it's Medicare for all, basically, it's not quite the same because it's like welfare for all, because there are a lot of people that are benefiting and will benefit from it that have not paid into the system. But more importantly, it would probably be better described as VA for all. Of course, they don't want to use that because right now, matter of fact, the individual that was supposed to be in the VA has stepped down, so we'll see where we go on that. But that's not a very positive image. But if you want to understand what a lot of these politicians who are going to be asking for your vote for, either in these primaries or in November, really mean in terms of a single-payer plan, all you have to do is look at the British healthcare system. You can look at Britain, you look at Canada, and as I said before, some of you that have come from those countries and called into this program say, well, it works pretty well for me. You know what? If you've got a cold, you've got a sinus infection, you've got a broken arm, works pretty well. However, if you need a kidney transplant or you need a heart transplant or you need a heart valve repaired or something that is going to be much more expensive, then you run into difficulties. And here's where we see that, because when you talk about an Alfie Evans or a Charlie Gard, they have very significant congenital problems. And so as a result, there's no real impetus in part of the British healthcare system, or even in some of the theories that have been put out in this country to treat people that level, because you recognize that they're maybe never going to be productive members of society. And so at that level, there's a desire to really prevent scarce medical resources going in that direction. And at the other level, those over the age of, sometimes they use 65, others use the age 75, we use a tremendous amount of healthcare resources for those individuals to keep them alive. But again, they're not productive for society. There is always the push to try to constrain and to control costs. And so the ones that are hurt the most are those with genetic defects, those with congenital abnormalities, or the aged. And so this, I think, is just one more reminder why you really want to know where your particular candidate who's asking for your vote stands on some of those issues. And if they say, I think we need to have government take over the health care system, you say, you mean like the VA? They'll come back and say, well, no, like Medicare. Oh, you mean like what's going on in England, where these parents were not even given the permission to take their sick child to the United States or to take their sick child to an Italian hospital. That may be not what we really want, and maybe we need to think of better alternatives. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Father Joseph LaFleur served the Army Air Corps as chaplain during World War II. In 1941, LaFleur dashed about Clark Field in the Philippines amidst bombs and flying shrapnel, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. For such bravery, the Army Air Corps awarded Chaplain LaFleur the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross. Later, while imprisoned by the Japanese for 3 years, he never stopped his ministry of care. He worked to meet the physical needs of his fellow prisoners, often bartering with guards for food. Once he confronted a fellow prisoner about stealing rations from other prisoners, even landing 2 holy punches to pacify the unruly and unrepentant soldier. In 1944, a U.S. submarine torpedoed LaFleur's prisoner transport ship. Rather than abandon ship or seek to escape Japanese gunfire and grenades lobbed in his direction, the chaplain worked to calm his men and to help them find an escape passage. Chaplain LaFleur died as he lived, in faithful service to his fellow man. Motivated by faith to care for their fellow man, chaplains in our nation's service routinely steady our servicemen and women before, during, and after battle. Military chaplains navigate the evils of war to bring good to our military. We honor Chaplain LaFleur and all chaplains for their dedication to the souls of our armed forces. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just mention, in the next hour, we're going to be talking with Jerry Newcombe, his piece, Confessions of a Christian Constitutionalist. We're going to talk about the influence of the Bible on America, something we talk about so often here on Point of View, and he wrote this piece because after he had done an article, or I guess it was a commentary on fake news, somebody said, well, you're actually propagating fake news by saying the Bible had anything to do with the founding of America. It was actually established by men who were products of the Enlightenment. So we're going to take on both of the issues. Was the Bible important in the framers of the Constitution, even the founders, the framers, and the presidents? And second of all, what about this idea of the Enlightenment? And then we're going to be talking with our good friend Dr. Ronnie Floyd, National Day of Prayer. He is the chairperson this year, and we'll be talking with him in that last half hour. So again, some of you would like to join the conversation. Feel free to do so, or just sit back and listen. Just before we run out of time in this segment, I want to come back to two issues we've talked about this week and give you some follow-up. One of those is, you might remember, we had Preston Condra in here just the other day talking about evangelism. And one of the points he made is that you really have to define your terms. First of all, know how to define the gospel. But interestingly enough, another thing you need to define is who God is. This piece from Christianity Today is really good. 80% of Americans believe in God, but we found out what they really mean. Amy Grant one time famously sang, "We believe in God," and 4 out of 5 Americans say that. But what do they really mean by that? And again, according to this survey from Pew, what they mean by God can vary quite a bit. Pastors and theologians often warn Christians against ascribing to a God of their own making, knowing that not all who say they believe they understand God as described in the Scriptures or in the traditional creeds of the church. How true that is. So even though God gets regularly evoked in prayer, platitudes, and phrases like "God bless America" or "In God we trust," even within Christianity, we have some really different conceptions about who God is. Does God judge? Does God love all? Does God control all that happens on earth? And this piece that came out in Christianity Today says that even in an era where more of the nation doesn't ascribe to a higher power at all, that's about 10%. So still we have atheists and agnostics, still a minority, although that's growing dramatically in the millennial generation that we've mentioned before, or believes in some sort of power or spiritual force. That's another third, 33%. A slim majority of Americans still believe in God as described in the Bible, 56%. So you can see that it's really important when you're talking to someone who says they believe in God, or even when they say, "I don't believe in God." Oftentimes, as we've talked about when we've done evangelism here on the program, ask them, what do you mean by God? And almost always when they say that, we certainly say, well, I don't believe in that God either, because that's not the God of the Bible that you have here. But interestingly enough, if they said, if you take the people of the book, let's look at Christians and Jews, first of all. American Christians, 80% of American Christians are more likely to believe in a biblical God. A minority position among Jews, only 33%, which tells me again that a lot of my Jewish friends, they're more secular Jews than they are Orthodox Jews. Then they go on to say a majority of American Jews view God as a higher power or spiritual force instead, and Jews are less than half as likely as Christians to describe God as all-knowing, all-powerful, loving all people regardless of their faults. So again, this piece that's come out just is a reminder of the need for us to really define our terms. When we talk about God, when we talk about the gospel, we talk about Jesus Christ. One of the other pieces that you might have heard us talk about is we had Ray Moore on just the other day, and Ray Moore was talking about some of the problems in the schools. Well, yesterday, Walter Williams posted this piece about educational fraud. He called it Educational Fraud Continues. And what he was looking at is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, called NAEP. It's oftentimes referred to the nation's report card. And it found that only 37% of 12th graders tested proficient or better in reading. In other words, 2/3 in round numbers were not reading at the 12th grade level. Only 1/3 were. And then, interesting enough, when you look at math, only 25% were proficient in math, which again, 3/4 were not, only 1/4 were. Walter Williams, of course, a professor at George Mason University and also African American, then also, of course, likes to look at the black population, and it's really discouraging. He says among black students, only 17% tested proficient or better in reading, and just 7% are proficient in math. So if you think about this, this means that even though we have high school graduation at about 80%, 8%. 8 out of every 10 young people this May, or whenever they graduate, most May, some in June, who get a diploma. We can see that if you have a graduation rate of 80%, that means that about 63% of those who are getting a diploma are not proficient in reading, and about 75% who are getting a diploma are not proficient in math. Well, then, interestingly enough, a very significant number of those who not only get a high school diploma go on to college. Among white high school graduates, that was about 70%. About black high school graduates, about 58%. And so, again, if you're only 37% of high school graduates are college ready, how come colleges are admitting 70% of them? And that's because colleges recognize we are just going to have to do something to deal with this. So one is they provide remedial courses. One study suggests that more than 2/3 of community college students take at least one remedial course, as do 40% of four-year college students. And then the other way in which this is adapted is college professors dumb down their courses so that ill-prepared students can get passing grades. And colleges also set up majors, he said, with little analytic demands that accommodate students with analytic deficiencies. And he said such majors often include the word studies, ethnic studies, cultural studies, gender studies, and American studies. And the point he's making is that most of these ill-prepared students, sadly enough, are in the field of education. When you look at the SAT scores, education majors placed 26th on a list of 38. So again, you have that. And of course, since it's a day when a lot of people are paying attention to the NFL draft, which will take place this evening, you can look at the scandals in the athletic department. He just gives one example. University of North Carolina, in which you had a learning specialist hired to help the athletes, that found that 60% of the members of the football team at University of North Carolina, 60% read between the 4th and 8th grade level, and about 10% read below the 3rd grade level. So again, you can see that in some respects, the educational fraud is still perpetuated on the American people. Something to pay attention to, and just again, one of the reasons why we've had some programs on why some parents might just consider finding alternatives to the public school system. Yes, they may graduate with a diploma. Some of them may not even be able to read the diploma. That may be a little bit of hyperbole, but for a few people, it's probably pretty close to accurate. And that, I think, illustrates only so well some of the scandal that is taking place in American education today. When we come back, we're going to talk with our friend Jerry Newcombe. He is talking about this idea of the Constitution and the Bible. How influential was the Bible in the founding of America, in the framing of our Constitution? And what did our early presidents think about the importance of the Bible? Then we're going to talk about this National Day of Prayer with our friend, Dr. Ronnie Floyd. All that coming up right after these important messages.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me once again. We've been talking about so many issues, the NFL draft and DACA, as well as the caravan of immigrants, and of course the president of France speaking the other day, and the plight of Alfie Evans, as well as the refuseniks, and the issue of political violence, education, even definition of who God is. There have been a lot of things we've covered in the last couple of hours, but I did want to now focus some time and attention on America's godly heritage. We do talk about that with some regularity here on Point of View, and wanted to give you an update on that because of a piece that we've also posted on our website, pointofview.net, Confessions of a Christian Constitutionalist. It is written by our good friend Jerry Newcombe, who is a weekly columnist. You can find his columns in WorldNet Daily, Town Hall, Christian Post, a variety of other places. Of course, we know him also as the on-air host and TV producer of the D. James Kennedy Ministries, author of more than 24 books, including a few that certainly relate to this topic. One that probably is very well known to many of you, George Washington's Sacred Fire. He was a co-author on that book. More recently, of course, we've talked about books like Doubting Thomas, The Unstoppable Jesus Christ. He is also a radio talk show host, and a while back wrote a piece about fake news, and then had someone say, wait a minute, you're propagating fake news by saying the Bible had anything to do with the founding of America. The Constitution was a product of men of the Enlightenment. So I thought we'd bring Jerry on to answer that objection. Jerry, thank you for once again joining us here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you, Kerby. Always a pleasure.
Okay, let's kind of break these down. First of all, maybe look at the founders, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, and those kinds of things. And maybe we'll look at the framers of the Constitution, and then what the presidents had to say. And along the way, we'll also take on that issue of the Enlightenment. But you start your piece by reminding us that we can take America all the way back to the Mayflower Compact in 1620. Talk about, for the Pilgrims and the Puritans, how influential was the Bible for them?
Oh, they created Bible commonwealths. The Bible, the church, they were the center of the town. They were the center of their life. They were the reason that they even came over. And when the Mayflower was actually blown off course, and they were really technically under no government's jurisdiction, the Pilgrims created a charter, a written charter for an agreement for self-government. And they did it basically on the model of a covenant as found in the Bible, a biblical type covenant, where they called on God as a witness, and then they created this agreement for self-government. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, having undertaken a voyage for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, ... do covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic. Well, this was the first, 1620, the first of about 100 or so compacts, frames of government that the Puritans, mostly the Puritans, created. Other Christian groups as well in the process. Probably the most famous of those on the way leading up to the U.S. Constitution was the Connecticut Constitution, which was called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It was actually inspired by a sermon. It was produced in 1639. It talks about how the importance of the liberty and the purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus, and it explains this is why we created this colony, is for the purpose of the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus. So anyway, they wrote up the first complete Constitution on American soil, and that Constitution is credited with being essentially an ancestor of the U.S. Constitution. Even to this day, Connecticut likes to call itself the Constitution state, and it's because of the fundamental orders of Connecticut. And so the idea that some people want to make, that all the founding fathers were a bunch of atheists and a bunch of deists, they were all men of the Enlightenment, they were a bunch of Masons, and they created a godless constitution. There's a continuity there that needs to be looked at historically, and I'd be happy to address the second part of that whole thing, or the Enlightenment part as well as the Mason stuff.
We'll certainly do that. Let me just mention another book that I've interviewed you on, and that is the book that made America, and that is the Bible. And so, again, there are some great resources which are available at jerrynewcombe.com. You can go into the books section and find out about many of your books. But let's talk about that for just a minute. One of the other interviews that we've done, and this was years ago, with Michael Novak, who at that time was at the American Enterprise Institute. He, and in your article, makes a distinction that I think is very important, because when people talk about the Enlightenment, they oftentimes think of David Hume or Voltaire. That's true, but there were two kinds of enlightenment, weren't there?
Yes, and this is extremely critical, and I'm glad you bring it up. John Locke is definitely categorized as an Enlightenment thinker. But John Locke was not an atheist. John Locke was a Christian. He even wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. One of our Sunday school teachers at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church about 10 years ago or 15 years ago was converted as he was studying at your alma mater, Yale. He was earning his Ph.D. at Yale and focusing on John Locke. And reading The Reasonableness of Christianity converted Greg Forster, and he's gone on to become, basically a writer and speaker for a think tank. I think the Manhattan think tank, or whatever, one of those kinds of things. But it's like this is incredible. John Locke then, was definitely a Christian, but also so was Sir William Blackstone, and Sir William Blackstone, again, categorized as a thinker of the Enlightenment. He wrote several or a handful of commentaries on the laws of England. And those commentaries were extremely important. And he talks about how basically that phrase, the laws of nature and of nature's God, that is Blackstonian to the core. It encapsulates in some ways much of his thinking. He's basically said that the Creator has created within his world, this world, his laws, but we don't know everything we need to know about the Creator from just the creation itself. Therefore, he supplemented it with the Holy Scriptures, the revelation of God, in the Scriptures. This is clearly, it's all totally, Christian in his thinking. And then another thinker, also often categorized as an Enlightenment thinker, Baron Montesquieu from France. He wrote in his book, The Spirit of Laws, we shall see that we owe to Christianity in government a certain political law, and in war a certain law of nations, benefits which human nature can never sufficiently acknowledge. So the idea that the Enlightenment, atheism essentially gave us the American Constitution, and before it the Declaration of Independence, is not accurate.
Yeah, let me take a break, and when we come back, we have some more to talk about with Jerry Newcombe. And one of the things I want to talk about is from his book, One Nation Under God, because when they went back and looked at the writings of the founders, and one of my major professors at Georgetown, as well as some at LSU and the University of Houston, put together that. We'll talk about where are the founders, what documents, and who were they quoting most often. And so, again, that's all part of this very excellent piece, which we've posted on our website. I would encourage you to read it. It's called Confessions of a Christian Constitutionalist. We have a lot more to cover with Jerry Newcombe. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The congressional hearings with Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg mostly focused on data collection and privacy. Fortunately, Senator Ted Cruz also raised important questions about what he called a pervasive pattern of bias and political censorship. And Senator Ben Sasse said he thought America might be better off not being policed by one company that has a really big and powerful platform. He even asked the founder if he could define hate speech. It turns out that censorship by Facebook is more than just incidental, and the problem of censorship is more pervasive. All of the big tech companies engage in censorship. Here are just a few examples. Facebook shut down the Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day page and has blocked a post by Fox News reporter Todd Starnes. Apparently, over 24 Catholic pages have been blocked. And, of course, the most recent example was the decision by Facebook about the African-American ladies known as Diamond and Silk, who Facebook considered unsafe for the community. Lots of people have had Twitter pull down their comments. For example, Representative Marsha Blackburn was blocked on Twitter because of her statement that I fought Planned Parenthood and we stopped the sale of baby body parts. Twitter shut down her video ad campaign, claiming it was inflammatory and negative. Speaking on videos, there's a lot of censorship at YouTube. Videos by pro-life groups have been removed. Dennis Prager and Prager University filed to stop YouTube from censoring their videos. A California federal judge dismissed their complaint. And in previous commentaries, I've talked about how Apple removed Chuck Colson's Manhattan Declaration from its iTunes App Store, and there are other religious apps that have also been removed. Each of these big tech giants portrays themselves as a neutral public forum. There is growing evidence of their bias and censorship. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, we'll take some of those phone calls in just a minute because you have a comment or question for Jerry Newcombe, who is with us, author of the book Confessions of a Christian Constitutionalist. And let's talk about, the influence. You mentioned Montesquieu and Locke and Blackstone. But when there were individuals that actually looked at and collected all the various writings during the founding era, I know you had a chance to interview one of those individuals who was involved with that. One of my major professors was involved with it as well. What they found, interestingly enough, Jerry, is that most of the time they were quoting from the Bible, and even then they were oftentimes quoting from the reprinted sermons of the 18th century. Tell us a little bit more, if you might.
Yeah, you're talking about Heinemann and Lutz study. Who did, excuse me, if I could
George
back
Carey.
up. Though,
George Carey was involved with some of that at Georgetown. But anyway, go ahead. Lutz is the one that's best known.
Neat.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's the bottom line. A major study was done in the late 1980s of the writings that the Founding Fathers quoted. They kind of wanted to see, well, who were the Founding Fathers quoted? And the most important thing to know is that more than 4 times than any human source, the Bible was quoted the most. And then as far as human authors are concerned, the number one was Baron Montesquieu, whom I quoted in the last section. And then number 2 was Sir William Blackstone, whom I mentioned in the last section. And then John Locke was number 3. And so they were basically quoting from Christian sources for the most part in terms of as they were framing the government. You don't see quotes from David Hume, atheism or whatever. And, it's funny. If I could say something, too, even, I didn't mention this in the piece, but this is an interesting point to note. that sometimes people can change, and sometimes they do change for the better or for the worse. I'll give an example. Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, in 1776, he has positive references to God in that book, Common Sense, which, by the way, was extremely influential at the time to the American cause. Later in life, he lost whatever faith or professed faith that he may have had and actually became an atheist. But sometimes what people will do is say, well, the Founding Fathers were a bunch of deists and atheists. Look at Thomas Paine. Well, it's not accurate to take the Thomas Paine writing in, let's say, 1793, when he wrote The Age of Reason, which was definitely anti-Christian, no question about it, and then impose that Thomas Paine on the Thomas Paine that wrote Common Sense in 1776. I just think that's an important observation.
Well, let me take a phone call, but then also one of the things in your article are some quotes from George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Let's take a call, and we'll head up to Maine. First of all, WSEW. Bob, you're on with Jerry Newcombe. What's your comment?
Hi, Jerry and Kerby. Nice to talk to you. I'm not very much on the Enlightenment, but wouldn't some of these many documents, colonial, whatever, harken back to even earlier Christian writings, such as documents such as the Magna Carta? I'm not very educated on that stuff, but maybe you could fill in a little bit.
Sure. I think that would be fair to say that the growing accumulation of wisdom in the West, especially, frankly, in the British tradition, was definitely influential. And Magna Carta was extremely important in 1215, written up by Archbishop Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. You might jump to from 1215 to 1689 when the British, wrote their Bill of Rights after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which basically was when William and Mary became king and queen. And they ousted, quite frankly, the guy who New York is named after, that is James II. But, I don't mean to bore you, but the bottom line is there's definitely collected wisdom, especially from the British tradition. And much of this gets back to the fact that the Word of God played an important part in much of, British political science. Especially beginning with King Alfred the Great. In fact, one of my mentors, Charles Wolfe, the late great Charles Hull Wolfe, once said that Alfred the Great was the only British monarch that they ever called the Great, but he was very much, caring that the Bible be the kind of the foundation, if you will, of government. And I think that's really important. That goes back, more than 1,000 years, about 200 or 300 years before the Magna Carta. So hope that answers the question.
Good question. Good comment. Just before we run out of time, let's talk, maybe you can give us a story or two or maybe a quote or two from some of the presidents, because we see this in the founders of our country. We see it in the framers of our Constitution. We also see the reverence for the Bible in the quotes from some of our early presidents, too, don't we?
Oh, yeah. If you look at the founders in their own words, you see in repeated ways that, they did not intend there be any kind of, secular, America to be a secular wasteland, as I put it. George Washington, for example, in a very famous letter that he wrote to all the governors of the states, he said at the end of this circular to the states that unless we learn to imitate the divine author of our blessed religion, and the context is it's Jesus Christ that he's talking about. Nobody doubts that. But unless we learn to imitate Jesus, we can never hope to be a happy nation. John Adams said in his inaugural address that what we need is a decent respect for Christianity among the best recommendations for the public service. Jefferson said when he wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1777, adopted in 1786, that basically it is a departure from the plan of Jesus, whom we call the holy author of our religion, if we force people to believe in things that they don't believe in, because if we do that, then we're departing from what Jesus would have us do. And James Madison, often attributed to, he's often called the father of the Constitution. He said, before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. By the way, that phrase, governor of the universe, is sometimes used, and certainly it's in reference to God, but sometimes those old-fashioned terms that they would use refer to Jesus. I mean, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, there's a reference to the supreme judge of the universe. Well, who is that? That's Jesus.
Yes.
Jesus is the one to whom judgment has been entrusted.
Yeah, and you gave a quote from Thomas Jefferson. I might just recommend a book that you authored on Doubting Thomas. Now, let's be fair, Thomas Jefferson, not exactly the Orthodox evangelical Christian, but sometimes there has been, again, a revisionism that's gone the wrong direction. So some of these books that you have put together over the years really give the complete story, and in many cases, you go back and look sometimes at 19th century, 18th century documents. The sad reality is a lot of people are quoting from 20th century textbooks and not really going back to the original sources. So, again, I commend all of your books to people so that they can really understand history from a biblical point of view.
Yeah, and going back to Jefferson just for a moment, that's a great point. Later in life, he certainly voiced in a private way doubts that he had on major Christian doctrines. Let's say, from writings you can find in 1809 or 1813 or 1820 or that kind of thing. But I was quoting from Jefferson from 1777. That's the same year that he, as a layman, played an active role in the founding of a Christian church that called an evangelical minister to the pulpit for that Christian church. It was called the Calvinistical Reformed Church of Charlottesville. In our book, we have the agreement that Jefferson wrote up for it, we being desirous of gospel knowledge. Jefferson, as a layman, gave more money to that church than any of the other lay people helping to found it. And in our book, Doubting Thomas, we have 2 sermons of Charles Clay that are reproduced. You can read for yourself the ministry that Jefferson supported at that time in his life, 1777, when he was in his 40s, as opposed to, when he was a much older man and he started to doubt, key doctrines. So when he talked about the holy author of our religion and he meant Jesus in 1777, he just might as well meant the Jesus that we know in the Bible, as opposed to, some weird, Unitarian type belief that he later adopted in 30 years later.
Yes. Well, again, we have a link to jerrynewcombe.com. You can find out more about his books, schedule him to come and speak. And, of course, we have this piece that was in WorldNet Daily, and it was in a number of other venues as well, Confessions of a Christian Constitutionalist. And, Jerry, thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you for answering that question from an email, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you, Kerby. God bless.
We're going to take a break, and Ronnie Floyd will be with us this last half hour. We're going to talk about the National Day of Prayer, and he's got some great comments about that, and I'd love to hear your comments about it as well. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we always like to do is, in advance of the National Day of Prayer, which is a week from this week, we really want to have you focus on what you can do to participate in your community. And so this is why we've always been privileged over the years to have the honorary chair people of the National Day of Prayer. And Dr. Ronnie Floyd is the individual who was named as the president of the National Day of Prayer Task Force. Of course, has been a pastor since he was 20 years of age, but he's really been the pastor of Cross Church in Northwest Arkansas since 1986. Also the founder of the Summit, which is kind of a business person's luncheon. Also, you know him from the Southern Baptist Convention. He served elected term as president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so, Dr. Ronnie Floyd, always great to chat with you here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Always good to talk with you.
You know, last time you and I saw each other face-to-face, we were at a prayer event in Washington, D.C., but I saw you another place where I was in the audience because you came and spoke at Prestonwood Baptist Church to the men, and the theme was on unity, which is actually the theme of the National Day of Prayer. But can I also say something about that son of yours? I have never had a chance to hear Dr. Nick Floyd. He is really gifted. I mean, he was taking us through 1 Kings 18, talking about each man having a decision to make and an opportunity for us to actually have a public faith, and to each man needs to take a mountain. Each one needs to have a posture of surrender. What an incredibly gifted communicator as well as you. So you come from a family of really gifted preachers, don't you?
Well, we're very blessed, and we're proud of what God's done in Nick's life, and praise him for it, and thank God for raising him up.
Well, I always love a Ronnie Floyd message, but I have to say that Nick Floyd is now on my list of I will go anywhere to go hear him. So if you could pass that on to him. Here's somebody who can remember his message from 2 months ago, so that shows the impact of some of his preaching. Well, when you were in front of us men, you were talking about unity, and that's the theme for the National Day of Prayer, Ephesians 4:3. Talk a little bit more about that, if you might.
Well, the reason we have that as our theme this year is obvious in the country. We have never seen it, I don't think, in our generation, Kerby, where there's more vitriolic speech, there's continual disharmony, division beyond imagination, and we're in a very despairing time in relationship to the unity in this nation. And obviously, I believe that one of the reasons it's that way is because the church is not modeling it and not influencing it in that regard. And I mean, churches all over America today, they're, even those individual churches many times go through enormous disunity. And so, to me, it all begins with that church and the churches of America. And when they are doing well and living in harmony with one another and the church itself all together, we have a chance to really encourage that in the country. But I tell you what, the bottom line is we better understand is a divided church cannot call a divided nation to unity. It just doesn't work that way. And this is a time where the church needs to really look at Ephesians 4:3. And really concentrate and ask themselves, what is God wanting me to do about becoming more intentional in promoting, advancing, and living out unity?
And again, unity, Ephesians 4:3, about making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. We can't expect always unity for the secular world, but we should expect it in the Christian world. And of course, that's some of the preaching that you have done, and I've had a chance to sit under your teaching in that regard. But one of the things we did, Dr. Floyd, before you came on, is we had Jerry Newcombe talk about the influence of the Bible in American history. And in the piece that we've posted here called My Plea by Dr. Ronnie Floyd, you talk about the Great Awakenings, the First Great Awakening, and revivals and those kinds of things. Speak to that, because I know that my own pastor, Pastor Jack Graham, and Jeff Young, who you know as well from your church, and others have talked about this importance of praying for revival. And if ever we've needed revival in America, now is the time we need to be praying about that. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, no doubt about it. And revival, again, starts with the church. And so it's important that we understand that it really begins with that. And in this nation today, we're in a desperate need for the next great move of God in this country. What we forget many times, Kerby, in the United States, because we take it so much for granted, is the United States in today's world, we are what we are. We have the spiritual heritage we have because of previous great awakenings and great movements of God that have happened in this country. And while we have not had what I would say would be multiple number of those moves, especially in the last many years, there was a time where God was really active in that and really shaping the nation. I mean, you take the First Great Awakening was followed years after that in relationship to the Revolutionary War. When you take the Second Great Awakening, followed that years after that came the Civil War. And my point is not that happens because of awakening, but at the same time, it's God preparing His people, and it's God moving in His people. You take the revival of 1857 and 1858. You had 1 million Americans out of 30 million Americans praying together. That's what you had. They called it the Great Prayer Revival, and now you know why. I mean, imagine what would happen today if 1/30 of the country was involved in a prayer gathering every week. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yes.
And so with that, you look at that, and then you think about the Jesus movement, which I was on the tail end of the Jesus movement. I mean, I really probably am in the ministry because of the Jesus movement, but it was really because I received some of the blessings of that after it was already going a long time, because I wasn't in my teenage years when all that started. But God really, has used that movement to really alter the entire nature of all kind of men that are within 10 years of my life. Your pastor being one of them, Greg Laurie being another one.
Yeah.
I mean, I could go on and on and on, about great men that you probably have interviewed in this program, or I know Pastor Jack has had at Prestonwood, and we've had many conversations on it. And the thing is, the one common denominator of that, Kerby, is always prayer.
Yes.
Prayer exceeds every great move of God. And that's what people need to understand, is that if we want to see God move in America, prayer is what precedes that move of God. And when you look at the subject of unity, we need to understand that unity is only accomplished by God. Therefore, we got to have God. And I got asked the other day, does prayer change? Does prayer really change things? Well, at times prayer changes things, but I can tell you one thing that prayer always changes, and that's you.
Mm-hmm.
It changes you. And so the key is, when you change, your things change that you're concerned about, and things change. And that's what needs to happen to America. That's what needs to happen to the churches of America, where we're involved in that, because, boy, we need the next great move of God in this country.
And again, if you would like to know a little bit more, one of the things we've posted is this piece called My Plea by Dr. Ronnie Floyd, and it gives you some history about Jonathan Edwards, of course, the Layman's Prayer Revival and the Fulton Street Revival there in New York City, and 1 million people praying. And, Chris, you also mentioned a little bit of the Jesus movement. That's the new book that Greg Laurie has coming out. We're going to have him on here shortly, because he'll be, of course, just down the road from us in June for another one of those outreaches in Dallas. So we'll be talking about that. So some great material that is available, and I really want to, Ronnie, encourage people to get this article, which we've made available, also to follow the link to the National Day of Prayer, because even if you can't find a location in your community, you can go to the shop there and pull together some material and have that event. So let's take a break, and when we come back, I have a few other quick questions for Dr. Ronnie Floyd, and is an individual that certainly is calling for unity, and that is the theme verse for this Thursday, May 3rd, which is Ephesians 4, verse 3. And again, if you want to also go to the nationaldayofprayer.org, we have a link to that as well. You can find out where these events are. You can volunteer to help with one of those as well, maybe donate to the cause. And also there's what's called a shop, which has all sorts of great resources that you could use to publicize this National Day of Prayer. I encourage you to pray for those in authority, pray for your pastors, pray for the church, the military, and all the rest. But especially on this National Day of Prayer, we call for you to pray for this nation. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Ronnie Floyd right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Father Joseph LaFleur served the Army Air Corps as chaplain during World War II. In 1941, LaFleur dashed about Clark Field in the Philippines amidst bombs and flying shrapnel, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. For such bravery, the Army Air Corps awarded Chaplain LaFleur the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross. Later, while imprisoned by the Japanese for 3 years, he never stopped his ministry of care. He worked to meet the physical needs of his fellow prisoners, often bartering with guards for food. Once he confronted a fellow prisoner about stealing rations from other prisoners, even landing 2 holy punches to pacify the unruly and unrepentant soldier. In 1944, a U.S. submarine torpedoed LaFleur's prisoner transport ship. Rather than abandon ship or seek to escape Japanese gunfire and grenades lobbed in his direction, the chaplain worked to calm his men and to help them find an escape passage. Chaplain LaFleur died as he lived, in faithful service to his fellow man. Motivated by faith to care for their fellow man, chaplains in our nation's service routinely steady our servicemen and women before, during, and after battle. Military chaplains navigate the evils of war to bring good to our military. We honor Chaplain LaFleur and all chaplains for their dedication to the souls of our armed forces. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Ronnie Floyd with us for just a few more minutes, and let me again encourage you to go to the website, nationaldayofprayer.org. Have a lot of facts, for example, 146 national calls for prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by the President of the United States, and all sorts of evidence and history. 1775, First Continental Congress called for a National Day of Prayer, perhaps one of the most famous, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln called for a day of prayer. And, of course, ever since 1952, every president has issued some proclamation for a National Day of Prayer. But one of the other things, Ronnie Floyd, I've seen you talk about in various venues is the importance of prayer and fasting that isn't something we tend to do so much. But speak to that, because this could be something that could be organized within various churches where they're listening right now.
It really could. You know, we've led our church through various periods of fasting. Fasting has really been on my heart for many, many years. The Lord has used that discipline for whatever reason to really impact my life. I think that, you know, we need to understand that the Scripture encourages us to fast and pray, to set aside something we really love. Specifically in Scripture, it was food, which is the most natural thing you do is eat. And but it's giving up the most natural thing you do for a select period of time in order to experience the supernatural intervention of God in your life. And the intervention there and the abstinence from that or the refrain from that for a simple period of time could be one meal. It could be a day. It could be a 3-day fast. It could be a 10-day fast. It could be a 21-day fast. It could be a 40-day fast. So, I mean, all those levels are in the Scripture. Every time there seemingly was always a great and mighty experience of movement of the Lord in people's lives because of that. It's exactly what I found. I mean, there's never been a time I have not sensed that or known that when I felt led to do that. And I would encourage people to pursue it. We have a book on that called The Power of Prayer and Fasting. Been out many years. In fact, it did so well that they put out an amended version of it that we updated greatly. And I rewrote probably 2/3 of the book, maybe 3/4 of the book. And that was released probably 4 years ago. The original book was in 1997, I believe, is when that was released. So I really believe deeply in the power of prayer and fasting.
And I might just mention we have a link to ronniefloyd.com, and there's a place for your books and all sorts of other resources that people can obtain, the podcast, the blog, the video, and all of the rest. And so that's certainly something that is available on the website, as well as this particular article, My Plea. So we've talked about the relationship between prayer and fasting. Just the other day, we had Preston Condra in here, and we were talking about evangelism. And one of the things you mentioned near the end of your piece is Dr. Billy Graham talked about the fact in his sermon, Can Revival Come? An awakening can bring about evangelization of the world in our generation. So there's another connection, and that is prayer and revival leads to telling the whole world about Jesus Christ. Can you speak to that?
Well, absolutely. You know, when we talk about the great awakenings of the past, an awakening is when the Holy Spirit really comes on a certain area or region of the country, and all of a sudden, many, many people come to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And to me, awakening is the overflow of revival. Awakening happens when God's people are what they need to be, and they're experiencing a renewal, a revival. There's a major movement of the Lord in their life, and you know, every now and then, even a church might have that moment. And I would just tell you that is what the need is, because if we don't advance the gospel, then you know there's not a whole lot of things we can offer this country, because ultimately the answer will not be in the political system. It won't be in government. It won't be in business or education or even church. Ultimately, if we're not giving them Jesus, that's not even the answer. Christ is the answer. He has been, is, and always will be.
And we have a link to your website. Might just mention, too, for our listeners in Arkansas, if you might want to go to one of the 4 locations of Cross Church. And again, you can go to crosschurch.com and find out a little bit more. But let me also encourage people to go to your website, because if they would like to watch a video, download a podcast, or maybe get some of your books, those are all available. And again, it's at ronniefloyd.com. Of course, we have links to, of course, the National Day of Prayer. And Ronnie Floyd, I really appreciate you stepping forward to call for unity, to call for prayer, and it just means a lot that you would give us a little bit of time today here on Point of View to challenge our listeners to be involved next Thursday.
Well, thank you, Kerby, and I really appreciate that. And I hope that every viewer finds a National Day of Prayer gathering near you. If you'll just look on social networking, they're going to be talking about it. You're going to maybe some advertised in various ways. You can always go to the website of National Day of Prayer as well. But obviously, the National Day of Prayer is a national law, and this is way bigger than just us. And so there will be thousands of gatherings going on that we may not even know exist, but until they exist. And so we just thank God for that and praise the Lord for it. And also, let me say this to you, Kerby, for all of your listeners today, is that on Thursday night from Statuary Hall at 7:30 Eastern Time, which is 6:30 Central Time, we're going to be doing the national observance of the National Day of Prayer. And I'll be leading that from Statuary Hall in the United States Capitol building. And I've got a tremendous group of people helping me. We're going to have prayer moments, worship moments. Out of Brooklyn Tabernacle singers are going to be with me. I have Priscilla Shire, who is going to be with me. H.B. Charles with me. Sammy Rodriguez with me. I have the pastor and wife from Sutherland Springs that lost their daughter, and 26 church members who are going to be with me. And it's going to be a riveting and yet a powerful and dynamic time of being and praying together. It'll be a full number of people there. It'll be on Daystar Television. It'll be live stream on National Day of Prayer Facebook page. It'll be live stream on nationaldayofprayer.org. And so there's all kind of places it's going to be out. So we'd encourage you to look on television, be a part of us on streaming, or even on the radio. So thank you so much for the privilege.
Well, thank you. Again, if people want to know more, go to National Day of Prayer under events. You can find an event near you, but also if you don't find one, create one, and then you can post or edit an event. And, of course, for that evening event, depending on which time zone you may be located in, you'll be able to watch it live, or sometimes they'll rebroadcast it as well. So, Dr. Ronnie Floyd, always great to have you in the program. Thank you again for your service to the National Day of Prayer, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. You have a wonderful day, and blessings to you. Look forward to seeing you again, Kerby.
We will do so. Let me just mention that just before we leave, again, we have some of the links to some of the conversation we've had. My commentary today is about big tech censorship, so you might want to download that as well, and some great resources we have made available to you on the website, pointofview.net. You will find many of these articles and many of these links, so take the time to find out about the Bible and America, which we talked about with Jerry Newcombe. Find the link as well to the nationaldayofprayer.org, and you can find out more about that event. And we want to give you a week's notice. If you can't find one in your community, why don't you put one together, and then you can post it, and other people might join you there as well. Want to thank Doug for his help behind the scenes. Want to thank Steve as well. Tomorrow is our weekend edition. Jeremy Dies will be with us, and maybe some others around the round table as we talk about all the issues in the news. So we'll join you then right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.